Welcome to Reformed Thinking. This is the deep dive where we look at scriptural principles that really reshape how we see everything, our world, our lives, and for today's discussion, what's in our wallets. We're taking on a topic that feels, very secular on the surface. We're talking about money. But we're looking at it through sources that define it as, well, purely spiritual, not just as an economic tool, but as the actual currency of what they call Christian hedonism.
And that's the whole frame for this.
Yeah.
The documents we're analyzing, they really lay down a challenge. They argue that how you relate to money, how you want it, how you go after it, how you use it, that whole relationship can either destroy your happiness forever, or it can build a solid foundation for eternal life. What you do with your bank account isn't some side issue. It has this immense spiritual weight. And when we say Christian hedonism, I think we need to pause there. It sounds like a contradiction. But the theological idea from these sources is, well, it's counterintuitive. It argues that the evil in the world doesn't come from our desire for happiness being too strong.
It's the opposite. The problem is that our desire for real, lasting satisfaction is just too weak. We settle. We trade this huge, unending joy that's found in God for these little fleeting pleasures, the buzz of a new purchase or the false security of a big savings account. So the love of money isn't some great ambition. It's actually settling for a cheap, low-grade kind of happiness.
Okay, so let's dig into that idea of destructive settling. If the big prize is that lasting joy in God, then worldly wealth is set up as its main competitor, its biggest distraction. The documents we're looking at, they focus almost entirely on these very direct warnings against the desire to be rich. They pull this from 1 Timothy chapter 6. And the text doesn't treat this desire as, a minor personality quirk. It's described as a very precise, predictable path to spiritual harm. This wanting to be rich, it says, causes people to fall into temptation, into a snare, into all these senseless and harmful desires. These are active words.
Yeah, the text is clear that these desires don't just cause little trouble for a believer. They actively plunge people into ruin and destruction. It's painted as this deadly, well-laid trap.
It's so important to sit with the specific spiritual outcomes of that craving. This goes way beyond just, bad budgeting. The material lays out two really devastating results that show why this desire is just completely at odds with faith. First, it causes a person to wander away from the faith. Now, that doesn't mean they wake up one day and say, I don't believe anymore. It's more of a slow drift, a gravitational pull away from what really matters.
How does that look in, real life?
Well, think about it. The time you might have spent in prayer is now spent constantly checking your stocks, calculating potential earnings. The trust you're supposed to have in God's providence gets overshadowed by anxiety over what the market is doing. The believer's focus just shifts from the promises of God to the uncertainty of the Dow Jones. Your devotion gets completely rerouted. The faith is still there on paper, but the actual living reality of walking by faith gets smothered by these daily calculations of getting more. Yeah. You wander because your heart is somewhere else.
And that second consequence you mentioned sounds even more personal. The craving for wealth makes believers pierce themselves with many pangs. That's such a graphic image. It's like self-inflicted wounds, deep suffering. It's not some punishment from the outside. It's the agony that comes from putting the wrong thing first.
Exactly. And that agony comes from a few places. There's the anxiety of protecting everything you've accumulated, right?
Yeah.
The constant fear of losing it all. There's the guilt from the compromises you probably had to make to get it. But the biggest one, I think, is just the deep nagging dissatisfaction. Because money can't fill that spiritual hole. So the person who gets rich but put wealth before God, they find they're still empty. And that emptiness, that feeling of being let down by the one thing the world promised would satisfy you, that's the pang that pierces your soul. You chose a cheap substitute that promised everything and delivered, well, nothing but spiritual bankruptcy.
I think a lot of us, myself included, can have a hard time seeing the line between, say, working hard to be a good provider and that sinful desire for riches. Is the argument here that any kind of material ambition is wrong, or is it about the intention behind it?
That is the key question. And the source material is very clear. The focus is on the desire, the love of money, not the money itself. The theological classification just confirms it. The love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. It's not just another bad habit. The sources call this craving the spiritual taproot that all the other destructive choices grow out of. It's choosing the gift, the comfort, the status, the stuff over the giver. It's choosing the fleeting pleasure that can't satisfy and in the end actually destroys the soul, instead of just resting in the love of God, who's the only one who can give that lasting joy.
And when you look at it from an eternal perspective, chasing wealth starts to look, well, absurd. almost tragic. Paul anchors this whole discussion in that fundamental reality of our own mortality. We brought nothing into the world, and we can take nothing out of the world. The sources use this really powerful, almost chilling analogy here. They compare the person who loves money to a fool who spends his entire life just collecting train tickets. Imagine he has hundreds of them, all meticulously organized and protected. He's totally dedicated to his collection, always getting more. But then when the final train to eternity is at the station, he's so weighed down by all that paper, all those useless tickets, that he can't even get on board. He misses the departure.
It's a haunting image, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah.
The investment wasn't just foolish. The consequence is absolute eternal loss.
And that really reframes what our culture today calls success. This warning is so necessary because our entire economic system, our advertising, it's all designed to exploit that fatal desire. Modern marketing is built to promote the desire to be rich, so sell you this vision of life where your happiness is directly tied to how much you can buy. The sources talk about what they call economic lies, and these lies are everywhere. They blind us to what's really going on spiritually. We're sort of taught to think that the only real money-related sin is, obvious stuff like stealing or fraud. But the real soul-crushing danger is in the craving for luxury, for status, for that spiritual high you get from material things. It often leads to this smug sense of being better than people who have less.
Right.
The sources actually point out that affluent societies that have focused on saving themselves with comfort have paradoxically created a whole new set of diseases, physical, social, psychological problems. It shows that in trying to prioritize our own comfort, we've nearly lost ourselves, body and soul.
So this sets up a huge conflict. If wanting to be rich is a spiritual death trap, then what's the right path for a believer? Paul gives the answer right away, a divine counter-strategy. There is great gain in godliness with contentment. And I love that phrase, great gain. Paul isn't saying gain is bad. He's redirecting our ambition towards something infinitely more profitable than money. That great gain is spiritual wealth. A godliness that can actually control that craving for stuff produces this tremendous spiritual richness that has value now and in the life to come. It's an affirmation that real profit is found in having your spiritual priorities straight.
And if we really break down what that contentment looks like, the text define it in the simplest possible terms: being satisfied with the absolute basics of life, specifically food and clothing. The argument is that it is incredibly profitable for believers not to chase wealth beyond that point. That contentment is itself a huge asset because it's like a spiritual immune system. It frees you from that whole destructive cycle of want and anxiety that Paul just described.
Okay, but hang on. Content with only food and clothing? In our modern economy, couldn't that be seen as irresponsible, especially if you have a family or obligations like healthcare, education? How does the source material square that kind of simplicity with, prudent planning in the 21st century?
It's a fair question and a common one.
Yeah.
We have to read that instruction through the lens of spiritual economics. It's not a legalistic rule demanding poverty. It's a strategic retreat from the craving for luxury. The source material argues that contentment with simplicity is the best possible spiritual position to be in because it frees up resources, both money and mental energy for the kingdom. And it's based on three big reasons that show this simplicity is not only possible, but good, even in a complex world.
Okay, let's walk through those three reasons, because this feels like it redefines what we mean by security. The first one is security in God. The sources argue that when God is near, when you truly believe he is for you, you just don't need extra money or things to feel at peace. God, the giver, is infinitely better than gold or any other gift. And when you believe that, when that's your reality, you're freed from that anxious, all-consuming love of money because your trust is in something that doesn't change, not in the ups and downs of the market. That assurance of God's presence just removes the need for a financial security blanket.
The second reason is fascinating. It gets at the limits of our own satisfaction. It's about access to true joy. The text claims something that seems counterintuitive. Accumulating money beyond your basic needs actually starts to reduce your capacity for deeper joys. It doesn't increase it. The deepest, most lasting joys that God offers, the ones you find in nature, in worship, in real relationships, in learning, are often free. The quick thrill of buying something expensive just can't compare to those sustained spiritual and relational joys. Once your needs are met, buying more stuff adds absolutely nothing to your heart's ability to feel real lasting joy. In fact, if you look at people who dedicate their life to luxury, you often find a deep spiritual boredom underneath it all. Simplicity keeps the heart open and sensitive to the great free joys God provides.
That reframes the whole idea. So the shift from getting more to living simply becomes a strategic move. And that leads to the third reason: investment for eternity. Simplicity frees up all those extra resources that would have been spent on yourself. Now they can be directed toward what actually lasts: funding the advance of the gospel and doing good works. Contentment basically stops the consumption pipeline and turns it into a distribution channel. The global mission implications of this are just staggering. The sources argue that if believers around the world truly embrace being content with just the basics, food and clothing, and stop chasing personal luxuries, billions of dollars that are already in the global church would be instantly freed up. That's a massive amount of financial power just waiting to be mobilized for spiritual causes.
And the scale of the need makes it so urgent. The sources say there are over 2 billion people who are currently unevangelized. They live in groups with no local established church that can reach them. And even though the total income of the global church is in the trillions of dollars, only a tiny fraction goes to Christian causes. And here's the shocking part: only about 1% of foreign mission funding actually goes to reaching those unreached groups.
Yeah.
So contentment isn't just a nice spiritual attitude, it's the fiscal switch that unlocks the funding we need to actually fulfill the Great Commission.
Realizing that kind of need forces us to change our language. Simplicity can sound a bit passive, inwardly focused, but the mission demands something more active, more strategic. And the source material introduces a new concept for this: the necessity of a wartime lifestyle. This kind of lifestyle is defined by being unencumbered with non-essentials. It's a strategic, outward-looking way to live that gets how high the stakes are. And the key is, it redefines what's essential. It's not about what our culture says is comfortable or what society expects. What's essential is defined by wartime effectiveness for a great and worthy cause, which is fulfilling the Great Commission and helping those in need to open the door for it.
That wartime lifestyle analogy is probably the most powerful concept in the entire source. Think about the historical example of the Queen Mary, the famous ocean liner. In peacetime, the Queen Mary was the definition of luxury. Fine china, fancy furniture, a few thousand wealthy passengers in spacious rooms, cocktail lounges. But when World War II started, that ship was immediately converted into a troop transport. All the luxuries were stripped out. The fine china was replaced with metal trays. The staterooms were filled with bunks stacked 8 tiers high. Its capacity exploded from around 3,000 to 15,000 soldiers. The mission completely changed the definition of what was essential, almost overnight. If it didn't directly serve the mission of moving troops, it was gone.
That analogy just makes you stop and think. If we really believe that's the level of urgency, that we're in a spiritual war where eternal survival is on the line, how do we actually live that out? The sources are clear. The essence of the Great Commission today is that the survival of millions of people depends on its fulfillment. We're called to spend ourselves for this cause.
And this is where the contrast between that wartime mindset and the peacetime lifestyle becomes, well, painful to look at. The sources observe that the main attitude in affluent Western societies has been, save yourself. We focus our resources, time, and energy inward on our own comfort and accumulation. And paradoxically, in trying to save ourselves, we've nearly lost ourselves.
Right. In saving themselves, these societies have invented that whole new set of diseases and social problems you mentioned. They come directly from prioritizing comfort over meaningful, outward-focused sacrifice. I mean, think about it practically. This inward focus leads to things like rampant obesity, heart disease, chronic stress, addiction, high divorce rates, isolation, all things that thrive when luxury and comfort are the main goals. Our labor-saving devices, meant to make life easier, become body-killing devices because we don't expend that energy on anything meaningful. It shows that putting personal comfort first doesn't lead to security. It leads to a breakdown of our physical, mental, and social health.
You can see this spiritual failure playing out on a global scale when you compare Christian giving habits. The sources point to the really low rates of missionary sending among wealthy Western denominations. It's like the desire for comfort just drains the missionary passion. The resources get absorbed by maintaining a comfortable status quo. Now, contrast that with the incredible, almost unbelievable zeal you find in impoverished Christian groups. The source highlights the Friends Missionary Prayer Band of South India. Despite having very little material wealth, they send exponentially more cross-cultural missionaries per person than almost any wealthy denomination.
Wow.
Just undeniable proof of where their spiritual allegiance is. The problem isn't how much money you have. The problem is the spiritual desire for wealth, which leads to that destructive peacetime lifestyle.
So, up to this point, we've focused on the danger of wanting to be rich and the need for simplicity. But what about believers who, through legitimate work, have already become wealthy? Paul gives very specific instructions for them in 1 Timothy 6. God clearly has a purpose for wealth, and it's completely different from what the world thinks. The first command for the prosperous tackles the two big dangers of wealth: avoiding pride and putting your hope in the wrong thing. The rich are told not to be haughty. The sources explain that money's biggest spiritual temptations are the power it gives and the pride it feeds. It creates this spiritual arrogance, a smug sense of superiority, and that arrogance is maybe the single biggest spiritual obstacle, which makes it so hard to enter the kingdom of heaven, just like Christ warned.
And that internal risk leads right to the second command: hope on God. The rich must not set their hopes on the uncertainty of riches. Money is fundamentally unstable. It can disappear at a market crash through inflation or be taken away. Riches always carry that spiritual risk of pulling your affections away from God the giver and onto his gifts, the money itself. So the command is to put your hope only on God, the one who provides everything for us to enjoy. But this brings us to a really common misunderstanding of God's provision. The text says God provides everything for us to enjoy, and that's often twisted to justify unlimited luxury. People think God is glorified when we indulge every material desire. The sources push back hard on that. They say God is not glorified when we hoard resources for ourselves that should be used to help the unevangelized, the uneducated, the unmedicated, and the unfed. That's not enjoyment. It's spiritual negligence.
Let's make that really specific. So, God doesn't prosper a business just so the owner can upgrade from a Ford to a Cadillac and spend the extra on personal comfort. God increases a believer's resources for his divine purposes. And those purposes are really twofold, and they're rooted in that wartime mindset. First, to enable the spread of the gospel to thousands of unreached peoples. Second, to alleviate global suffering, to remove the physical barriers that stop people from hearing the gospel. Prosperity is given so believers can prove that their money is not their God. We're meant to be conduits of grace, making sure the resources flow out to those who need them most.
And the move from attitude to action is critical here. The rich are commanded to do good, to be rich in good works, to be generous and ready to share. This is the practical application of the wartime lifestyle for those with abundance. Their extra wealth must be deliberately channeled toward relieving spiritual and physical misery around the world. This active, intentional generosity is exactly how you lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven. Jesus commands believers to provide yourselves with money bags that do not grow old, talking about a treasure in heaven that can't fail or be stolen. This means using your earthly treasure for merciful purposes in Christ's name here on earth, and in doing so, securing those eternal yields.
What's really amazing is that Christ explicitly commands us to go after this heavenly reward. He tells us to be generous, to invite the poor, the crippled, the blind to our meals, people who can't possibly pay us back, with the promise that we will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. This reframes giving not just as a duty, but as a commanded act of, well, eternal, self-interested investment. So if the goal is a reward, why isn't that just selfish? The source material clarifies that chasing this reward isn't selfish because the ultimate goal isn't for you alone, it's shared. Our generosity isn't some fake love because our real goal is to bring other people into that same heavenly joy. Our happiness in heaven will be greater, it will be doubled, if the people we show mercy to, the unevangelized, the suffering, are won over to Christ and join us in praising him forever. It's the pursuit of a shared communal happiness.
Which means we have to state the theological fine print here. Generosity does not earn you eternal life. Salvation is a gift of grace, received by faith, by resting in God's promises. But, and this is a huge but, the sources stress that how you use your money, this really volatile and tempting currency of Christian hedonism, it either confirms or denies the reality of that faith. Your actions show where your heart really is and whether you truly believe God is better than gold. This whole discussion really comes down to understanding three levels of living. Level 1 is the path of sin. You steal to get. Level 2 is the typical path of the world. You work to get what you need for yourself and maybe a little comfort. But the biblical call, the wartime lifestyle, is level 3 living. You work to get in order to give. God intends for believers to be these clear conduits of his grace. The great spiritual danger is thinking the conduit itself should be lined with gold. Copper will do just fine. The gold is meant to flow straight through to the unreached and the suffering, not to be absorbed by the pipe.
So, to bring this whole deep dive on money and eternity to a close, let's go back to Paul's main purpose for all this instruction.
Paul's entire purpose in 1 Timothy 6 is laser-focused. It's a guide us to lay hold of eternal life and not lose it. Every instruction he gives about contentment, about the danger of desire, about generosity, he sees it all through the lens of eternity. He sees how our choices with this temporary currency either secure the life that is truly life or lead us to ruin and self-inflicted pain. Our spiritual future really does hang on these seemingly ordinary financial decisions.
So to secure that future and use the currency of Christian hedonism wisely, the path is pretty clear. Don't fall for the desire for riches. Intentionally choose contentment with what's necessary for wartime effectiveness. Set your hope completely on God, not on temporary wealth. Actively guard against spiritual pride, and let the joy you find in God overflow in generosity toward a lost and needy world. That combination confirms that your real treasure is safe in heaven, and your hope is in the giver, not the gift.
So, thinking about that wartime lifestyle analogy and the great cause of the gospel, here's a final thought. What is one non-essential item or habit in your life, one of those luxuries you've gotten used to, that if you removed it or repurposed it would most effectively free up tangible resources for that critical spiritual mission? That's the question we should let rearrange our priorities.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the currency of eternal joy. We encourage you to reflect on where your treasures are really stored and what you're placing your ultimate hope in. Until next time.